Now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall only die." And they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there. For the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army. So they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us." Therefore they arose and fled at twilight, and left the camp intact, their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, and they fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they went into one tent and ate and drank, and carried from it silver and gold and clothing, and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent, and carried some from there also, and went and hid it. Then they said to one another, "We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." So they went and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, saying, "We went to the Syrian camp, and surprisingly no one was there, not a human sound, only horses and donkeys tied, and the tents intact." And the gatekeepers called out, and they told it to the king's household inside. So the king arose in the night and said to his servants, "Let me now tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, 'When they,' in other words Israel, 'come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get into the city.' And one of the servants answered and said, 'Please, let several men take 5 of the remaining horses which are left in the city. Look, they may either become like all the multitude of Israel that are left in it, or indeed I say, they may become like all the multitude of Israel left from those who are consumed. So let us send them and see.' Therefore they took 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent them in the direction of the Syrian army, saying, 'Go and see.' And they went after them to the Jordan, and indeed all the road was full of garments and weapons, which the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. So the messengers returned and told the king. Then the people went out and plundered the tents of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people trampled him in the gate, and he died, just as the man of God had said, who spoke when the king came down to him. So it happened, just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel, shall be sold tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. Then that officer had answered the man of God and said, 'Now look, if the Lord would open windows in heaven, could such a thing be?' And he had said, 'In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it.' And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died." There's a story about a peevish old man who had boarded a train. He occupied what he felt was the best seat he could find, and then he tried to reserve the seat next to him by placing his luggage in it. And just before the train pulled out of the station, a teenage boy came running up and jumped on board the train. "This car is full," growled the old man, who had taken the best seat near the front of the coach, and this seat next to me is reserved. A friend of mine has put his bag there." The youth paid no attention. He sat right down in the seat. "All right," he said, "I'll stay here until your friend comes." And with that, he placed the travel bag on his lap while the elderly man glared at him in vain. Of course, the friend never showed, and soon the train began to roll away from the station. As it glided past the platform, the young fellow grabbed the travel bag and tossed it out the open window of the train. He said, "It looks like your friend missed the train. We don't want him to miss his luggage too." Now, selfishness has a way of backfiring, doesn't it? We all are familiar with it. We're familiar with our mother and father saying, "Share, don't be selfish." And yet we know that even people who expect us to be selfish, or whom we expect to be selfish, sometimes surprise us with their generosity. Take, for example, these 4 lepers mentioned in our text. You know that Moses' law expressly forbade people with any sort of a skin disease from living in the community. They were considered a public health nuisance and risk, and they were barred from the city limits. For all intents and purposes, they were excommunicated from all social and religious functions and activities. But in the city of Samaria, during the time of Elisha, things were particularly sad, particularly unfortunate. Here's why. Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, had gathered all of his military forces, surrounded the city of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, cut off the supply chain of food and water to the city, and was now slowly starving the city into submission. Now, while all this was going on within the city limits, just outside the city gates lived these 4 lepers. Perhaps they were in some kind of impoverished shanties or tents that they had set up for themselves. They too were starving to death, but their plight was even more pathetic. They didn't have the protection of the city walls. They had no food. They had no water. They had no one to look after them. They were the most vulnerable as the Syrian army approached to conquer Israel. To remain where they were meant certain death. And to go back into the city, they knew there was no food. And so after talking among themselves, they agreed that their best option at this point was to surrender to the Syrian army. After all, the worst thing that could happen to them was that they would be killed and put out of their misery all the quicker, or maybe, just maybe, the Syrians would claim them as POWs and at least give them a meal to satisfy them during their captivity. And so here's what they did. At twilight, they got up, they stumbled along into the Syrian camp, and lo and behold, what they found was amazing. No one was in sight. The place was like a ghost town. I mean, a scene from Twilight Zone. Furthermore, food, drink, arms, ammunition, silver, gold, clothing were all around. The secret behind this abandoned camp could be explained through one man and the power of God and the power of prayer. Elisha, if you look back at the previous chapter, had prayed. And the prayer of the prophet of the Lord resulted in something wonderfully mysterious that the Lord did. God interposed himself into the situation. And here's what he did. God created a thunderous noise like horse hooves and chariots approaching, as if Israel had summoned its allies to come in her defense. And so when they heard all of this, they immediately became panicked, and the Syrian army left their own campsite. The sound effects created such panic that they left behind their tents and hardware, their gold and their silverware, their uniforms, their articles of clothing, some of their weapons, the best of the campfires, and the food stash. It was like walking in on Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas morning all at the same time. And these 4 lepers began to help themselves. They rushed in from tent to tent, eating and drinking and stashing the booty. It went on for quite a while before one of them stopped and said, "Hey, guys, we're not doing right. This is good news. And our fellow countrymen are back there behind the city walls, starving to death, and here we are gorging ourselves. We need to go back and tell them what has happened, and we shouldn't wait until morning lest something evil overtakes us for having been so selfish. Let's get going and give them the word." Imagine that. Here were 4 diseased, distressed, and destitute lepers, socially ostracized from society, forced to beg, and yet now, all of a sudden, through the miraculous intervention of God, they are rich. And what is one of the first things that happens? They're convicted of the need to share. They feared that some mischief would overtake them if they remained silent at such a time as this. They said, "This is good news, and we do wrong if we don't share it." So they made their way back, they shared the news, and it was met by a skeptical King Jehoram, who thought that for sure it was just a keen bit of military strategy on the part of the Syrians, and what they were really doing was laying in wait to ambush the Israelites when they come out. And so after sending a small espionage unit to confirm the story, King Jehoram never acknowledged that the words spoken by Elisha, the Lord's prophet, had indeed come true. The famine had ended, and the food prices went from being sky high to very low. Prior to this, women behind the city walls of Samaria were cooking and eating their own children. Now, as people who have been familiar with the term grace as Christians, we know that grace means this: God's redemption at Christ's expense. That's a good way to remember it. God's redemption at Christ's expense. And what that means is this: that in the person and work of Jesus Christ, you and I have received riches. We have received the gift of salvation. We have received the water of life freely. The fountain has overflowed into our lives. The Bible says, "Of his fullness have we all received," and grace for grace. In other words, God not only gives grace, but he gives you and he gives me the grace to receive that grace. So really, what it's about is something the hymn writer wrote about when he said, "Not have I gotten but what I received, grace has bestowed it since I have believed. Boasting excluded, pride I abase, I am only a sinner saved by grace." God has done something. God has poured his best into our lives by giving us his Son to die on the cross. Now, here's what Jesus says about that. Having experienced that grace, he says, "To whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to whom much has been committed, of him God will ask the more." if during our earthly lives we were blessed with material resources, talents, understanding, the experience of a mother or a father or a friend who shared Jesus Christ with us and we came to faith, perhaps a Sunday school teacher, then here's what the Bible says. We will be held to a greater standard of responsibility than someone who has never had those privileges. Now, you can add to that whether it's wealth, material wealth, whether it's formal education, whether it's an inheritance we received, or whether it's this spiritual nurturing. Not to share it will stunt our own development, and it will suffocate our own humanity. Now, I'm not talking here about a moralism. You know, many people you'll hear, well, I have taken from the community and it's time for me to give something back to the community. That's good, but that's not what we're talking about. No, what I mean is this. Anybody who looks deeply into the life of the soul will see that really there are two streams that flow into the soul. One is from the past and one is from the future. And they're continuously meeting one another. And people, places, events which have knowingly become a part of us in our past convey God's grace to us. They may be people we've met, they may be people who've known us, they may be people that we've worked with, they may be people that we grew up with, they may be people in church, there may be experiences that we've had, but like it or not, God has been using these as a means of grace, a medium, if you will, that has been pouring into us over the years goodness and wealth. And you and I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for them. I know I wouldn't. I grew up in a large family, but it was my mother's influence. It was her faith that was modeled for me. Now think for a moment about yourself. Think what your life would be like had you never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. You never knew what it was like to be told that your sins can be forgiven, that broken relationships can be restored, that the worst disaster and trial that you've been through, you can receive the mighty help of God like Israel did that day. Grace, mercy, peace. Hope beyond the grave. The reality of a present purpose, something to live for in a world where everybody seems to be chaotic and living for themselves. Face it, you and I are living on these riches every day, and somebody had to pass the baton of faith from one generation to the next, or we wouldn't be here. It was before 1986, sometime, he was recognized as one of the world's top nuclear medicine and radioisotope experts. Today, Dr. John C., a Chinese Canadian, is a minister of the gospel in Canada. But he tells a story about his childhood, and here's what he said. He said his father and mother fought almost every night. He said his father routinely beat up on his mother physically. His father was a gambler, a heavy smoker, never attended church with the rest of the family, and his father never gave John any help with his homework, and his grades plummeted, and he was at the bottom of his class. And then one day, a woman came to John's home, and this woman talked to John's father. She was a Christian, and she was pretty direct, pretty bold in speaking to John's father and presenting the gospel. In fact, one might say that she did everything wrong as far as what you're trained to do or not to do in personal evangelism. Didn't matter. God used that woman to share the gospel, and then he blessed it. And amazingly, John's father listened. And although he didn't become a Christian immediately right then with that woman, the next Sunday, John's father got the family up, ready to church, and he went along with them. And eventually he ceased beating up on his wife. Eventually he helped John, and John's schoolwork went from being at the bottom of his class to the top of his class at the end of the year. And at the height of his career in the scientific community, having received many national and international recognitions for his research and his appointment by the UN, Dr. John C. left it all to follow Jesus Christ and became a minister of the gospel and pioneered 2 churches in Edmonton, and since 1990 has become a global evangelist. Now, all of that to say, that's a stream from the past that comes into the human soul, and the response of the lepers is that of a normal human heart that is touched by Jesus Christ and gratitude for God's deliverance. The events of the past affect us today. But neither can we deny that there is a reality of the future. To live only in the past would be to obstruct our development. To be a soul fully alive means that there is and has to be some investment in the future. There has to be something that calls forth something from our lives. Now, by rights, it doesn't seem that sympathy for their suffering brothers perishing back behind the city walls safely would have been enough to urge the lepers to return to Samaria. But fear of some evil befalling them did. But the point is this: these 4 lepers represented the most destitute and hopeless people caught in that situation. But they didn't sit still. They didn't wait for death to come to them. The Bible says and speaks of the martyrs, and it says, they loved not their lives unto the death. Do you hear that? They weren't about self-preservation. They weren't preoccupied with themselves. They had laid their life down and made a decision that whatever happens, it was worth dying for Christ. So they went into the Syrian camp because they were reduced to that alternative. And a big part of the moral chaos and the moral confusion in America today is that people have too many choices. And the second moral peril is that they not only have too many choices, but many of us have too much time on our hands to think about ourselves. Both are threats to the social and spiritual harmony of community and of a nation that calls itself the United States of America. See, there are critical periods in this life when the whole of our future hangs on a decision, on a personal decision. And to sit still and let things take their course means that you're only going to be carried away by the current. You'll be carried away by the same exposure to evil associations, the same demoralizing principles, the same destructive habits that only invite further disaster. One of the most common misperceptions that Jesus ran into in his ministry was the idea that positive, hostility, and active resistance to the gospel are necessary to ensure that a soul will go to hell. Wrong. Here's what Jesus said. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already. You don't have to do anything. Just stay the way you are. Don't do anything bad. Don't do anything good. That's all it takes to be condemned. It's not enough to remain indifferent to God's offer, to ignore Christ, to ignore the relationship he offers, to disregard the transformation of your character that he affords. It's not enough not to bear glory to his name. Jesus says you don't have to be an atheist. You don't have to be an obstructionist. You don't have to be an antagonist to God. You don't have to go on television and parade a vile form of behavior. All you have to do is ignore me. Now, I lived in Colorado for some years, and outside the city of Denver in the Rockies, there is a spot that is called, as you know, the Continental Divide. It crisscrosses more than once in the southern part of the state, but up near Denver, there is a plaque on the site of the Continental Divide, and it states that all the rivulets and rivers and streams made by melting snow on the eastern side flow to the Atlantic, and all of those on the western side flow to the Pacific Ocean. Young and old, rich and poor, educated or uneducated, let the years come and go, but know this, there's a continental divide for the soul. And that continental divide is called death, and if you and I just sit around and do nothing but wait for it, the years, the days, the months go by, and there's really nothing that really compels us. There's nothing that stirs us to engage in the work of Christ's kingdom. There comes a day, Jesus says, when we'll have to answer, not only for what we've done, but for what we've left undone. You see, it all begins at the cross. Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. That's the message we have to show. Don't complicate it. It doesn't need to be complicated. Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. And if today I am willing to acknowledge that I am one of those sinners, then Jesus came to save me. And he came to save you. And he came to save your neighbor. And he came to save that distant relative who is rejecting Jesus Christ. Bishop John Taylor Smith was an honorary chaplain to Queen Victoria and the chaplain general of the British Army during World War I. He was considered everybody's bishop. He was jovial, he was rotund, he was saintly. And Bishop Smith used to interview candidates for chaplaincy in the army by asking them one determining question. And this is what he would say. Now, I want you to show me how you would deal with a man. We'll suppose that I'm a soldier who's been wounded on the battlefield. I have 3 minutes to live, and I'm afraid to die because I don't know Christ. You tell me how I can be saved and have the assurance that it is well with my soul. So here's the applicant. Here's the chaplain general interviewing him. And if the applicant begins by beating around the bush and saying, well, the true church or the ordinances, or if you would, no, the bishop said, that won't do. I have 3 minutes to live. Tell me what I must do to be saved. And unless the candidate could answer that question, he could not become a chaplain in the British Army. Jesus Christ came into the world to put away your sin and mine by his death on the cross. And for those who will dare to abandon themselves in faith, relying on nothing else but Jesus' blood and righteousness, then they will find, like these 4 lepers, we're wrong. This is too good of news to keep to ourselves. We have to tell somebody, and we have to do it today.